These clips are part of an academic course, so I should probably not just provide you with some fun facts, but also with some theory. And one theory that's relevant in the case of the processing, the experiencing of digital literature and other works of art, and basically all sorts of things that you may perceive in your everyday life, is fluency theory. And one way to look at fluency theory, one way to define it is by this citation here. The idea is that the more fluently a perceiver can process a certain object or a certain entity, a certain event, the more positive is his or her aesthetic response. So the idea is, when do people actually like something? When do they find something beautiful? And it turns out, if the thing that you're perceiving is being perceived by you as being more sort of fluent, if this process of experiencing it is more fluent, you seem to like it more on average. So one example, for instance, is symmetry. So if you're looking at this picture here, in general, it turns out that people appreciate this picture on the left a bit more than the picture on the right. And the idea is, because it's symmetric, it's more or less easier to process perhaps for your brain. And that's why you might like it more. This also is typically related to faces, for instance. If someone has a symmetrical face, perhaps you will like that face a bit more than a less symmetrical face. So apparently that's easier to process. So if your experience is a bit more fluent, and then the idea is you would like it more. You would have a more pleasant aesthetic experience. This has also been applied to poetry. So in a study a couple of years ago, some researchers presented the same poem to people, to readers, but in a different font. And then the idea was, do people like the same poem more if the font in which it is presented sort of leads to a more fluent experience? So here you see the same poem, the same poem in Dutch twice, but the font on the left is way easier to process than the font on the right, right? And then the idea is, how much do people appreciate this poem? Do they actually indeed appreciate this poem on the left more than the poem on the right? Even though it's exactly the same poem, it's just the font is different. And this is actually what they found. So if you look at a broad audience and make people read those poems one at a time, ask them, how much did you like this poem? How much did you appreciate this poem? Then in general, what's found is that they in general like easy poems more than difficult poems overall. And if those poems are presented in an easy to read font, they like it even more. So apparently the general public, if something's easy to process, they like it more. That's the basic idea. Right, so a couple of years ago, we also sort of went beyond this in a typical student master thesis project, in which the research question was, to what extent can VR be used to enhance poetry appreciation by making poems more fluent, or by making the perception of a poem, the experience of experiencing a poem, more fluent. So the idea is, if people like things more, if they're easier, if they have a more pleasant aesthetic experience, if they experience in general something that's a bit more easy to understand, can we maybe start using VR to make poetry a bit more accessible, a bit more easy to understand? There are all sorts of things you can think about that or say about that. But this is just a more empirical test to see whether this works in general at all. So we came up with a certain experimental design in which we took a couple of poems. We presented them to people in the library, one at a time. Every person participating just saw one poem in one condition, and this poem could be presented to them in text on a sheet of paper in the way you would perhaps traditionally read a poem. Other participants would listen to the same poem, and yet other participants would listen to this poem, but also at the same time wear a headset and see a virtual environment at the same time that sort of matched the content of the poem. And then we had easy poems and difficult poems. And this is what the poems look like in Dutch. Don't worry if you don't understand Dutch. Just believe me that this is an easy poem and this is a hard poem to understand conceptually. We also had two more poems. One is a bit more easy than the other one. One is easy, one is hard. And then we asked this graphics designer to come up for two of those poems with a nice virtual environment that sort of matches the conceptual content of this poem. So the hard poem, the conceptually difficult poem, actually was about a family that sort of over the years becomes larger. So new kids are being born, but this is not super easy to understand if you read the poem. So we thought, if we make a graphic environment that sort of shows this at the same time, related to the textual content of the poem, Maybe this makes the poem a bit more easier to understand, a bit more fluent to perceive, and perhaps then people start liking it more. So again, for a different poem, this poem was about cycling up a hill. Conceptually easy poem. Again, a virtual environment was made in which you see a little guy cycling up a hill, such that the poem perhaps becomes a bit more easy to understand, a bit more fluent to perceive. And again, we wondered, would this sort of lead to enhanced appreciation of this poetry? For two other poems, we didn't have any conceptual content to show while people were listening, but we sort of highlighted in color the rhyme pattern of the poem. Again, to see whether if we sort of highlight this, will those poems be perceived more easily, more fluently, because people are sort of reminded of the rhyme pattern. This makes it a bit easier to appreciate the poem, perhaps. Right, so every participant listened or read one poem. They read it on paper, they listened to it via headphones, or they listened to it in a virtual environment. And then we simply asked them afterwards using a questionnaire, how much did you like this experience of reading or listening to this poem? Right, and then it turns out, again, overall, people like easy poems more than difficult poems. So apparently, people just like to perceive things that are more or less easy, that are not too difficult to them, then they like it more. And interestingly, what we found is that they liked poems presented as text less than poems presented auditorily, so via headphones. I think that's already is a sort of interesting finding, because it sort of shows that if you're perceiving the same thing in a different modality, you might like it differently. And the most relevant here is that actually if we looked at conceptually difficult poems, so poems that are conceptually quite difficult to understand if you would read them on paper, there really virtual reality adds something. So it really enhanced the topic clarity of the conceptually difficult poem. So people afterwards said that they had a better understanding of this poem if there was also this virtual environment presented at the same time. So that was sort of a nice student project, very typical master thesis project, I would say. And what we observed was that in line with this fluency theory, people seem to appreciate easy poems more than difficult poems. Maybe you have the same experience yourself. And VR really has a potential to add something to poetry. In this case, really, it enhances the clarity of the topic of a poem. And of course, then you might start thinking about societal relevance of this, societal implications. So this finding actually could mean that if you start adding this VR component to poetry education in secondary schools, for instance, perhaps pupils start understanding poems a bit better. And this might actually enhance the pleasure that they have when they're experiencing such literary texts.